One, recording.
Good evening. Welcome to our third Rotary District 5010 forum on community and on building our local communities and economies. I'm Joe Cash. I'm the district governor for the Rotary 2021 year, and I'm delighted to have everybody here. I'm particularly delighted to have my old friend Mike Navarre speaking with us this evening. Mike was twice Kenai Peninsula Borough Mayor, a state legislator for many years, and a successful small business person. Most recently, Mike was Commissioner of Commerce, Community and Economic Development. Mike's topic this evening will be on state fiscal stability as a foundation for future economic growth. Mike, thank you very much for being with us, and go ahead. And I'll advance the slides as you request.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks to the Rotary for giving me this opportunity. I've been out of politics for a couple of years, so occasionally go through withdrawals. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. It's something that I started talking about probably 30 some years ago when I was in the legislature, the need for a long-term fiscal plan for Alaska. It's something that we have never had, and so we stumble from one to the next. So this presentation was put together when I was commissioner in 2018. It's a little bit dated, but not so much that I guess the points I'm trying to get across will be confused. So Alaska's economy, a bright future, but are we prepared? Next slide, Joe. So Alaska has a really bright future because we have a lot of opportunities. We're still a very young state. We've got mining, we've got oil and gas, we've got both commercial and sport fishing, we've got agriculture, we've got tourism. Alaska is poised, I think, for a very, very bright future. Next slide. So what's happening in our economy, and does Alaska still need a fiscal plan? The next slide is one that I show over and over and over and over again, and I've showed it since I was in the legislature. I left the legislature in 1996, but to talk about the fact that a lot of Alaskans are still don't know that Alaska's production, oil and gas production, peaked in 1988. It's been trending down ever since. And this is just the production forecast that shows how far we've declined since 1988. The next slide shows the GDP from oil and gas. It's volatile, very important to Alaska's economy, and the dates on this are 1997 to 2015. So this is the GDP from oil and gas. The next slide shows GDP, same time frame, GDP from all other sectors of Alaska's economy and the growth that's taken place from 1997 to 2015 in those other sectors of Alaska's economy. Now, the next slide is one that I wish I'd done this in PowerPoint, but I'm going to walk you through it. The bottom line on the very bottom, which says unrestricted petroleum revenue. That's the revenue that's derived from oil and gas production in Alaska. The blue line that's right on top of it, tracks it pretty closely, is unrestricted general fund revenue when you add every other source of income in Alaska. So all the other taxes that we get for, or fees, et cetera, that we get, unrestricted general fund revenue, it only moves that line a very little bit. And if you look clear over at 75, at the far left of the map, you can see that back then when we had an income tax, we had money from oil and gas, but we also had money from income tax and school tax and other things that helped fuel Alaska's state government. Now, that red line is the GDP from oil and gas that I showed before. That other line on top is the GDP from all of the private industries in Alaska, that other GDP slide that I showed, and that's where the disconnect comes from. We talk all the time about diversifying our economy. The fact of the matter is we have diversified our economy over the last 25 years. The problem is we haven't diversified the revenue sources that accrue to the state from those other areas of our economy. So the next slide we'll get into it. Do we need a fiscal plan? You know, you hear all kinds of stuff. The status quo is okay. Oil and gas is going to save us, or economic development will save us, or cutting government will save us. So let's just walk through those quickly. Can we just rely on oil and gas development or oil price increases? Well, recent history shows the answer to that is an absolute no. And particularly with this pandemic going on, it's really impacted oil and gas prices and certainly Alaska's revenues. So, but there is good news. The next slide shows that, and again, these are from 2018, but they haven't changed much. There's been some modest increases in production, not much, but modest, and we slowed the decline in this. More than that, we slowed the decline. NPR is beating expectations. ConocoPhillips has Moose's Tooth 1 and 2, which one's online. I think 2 it just came online, and there's other prospects on the line, which include Willow, Smith Bay, Armstrong and Oil Searches projects, et cetera, et cetera. So there's good news in oil and gas. The next slide, you know, Navarre was open, so there's always been great potential in Navarre. We don't know what's there, but the federal government did open it up. North Slope future looks pretty bright with all of those things. The LNG project is on a hiatus now, but at some point, maybe that will provide some opportunity for Alaska. But as the next slide points out, all development in oil and gas takes a lot of investment in order to get to production. And in order to encourage development and investment in Alaska, when making those types of decisions, investors look closely at both profit potential and fiscal stability. And we've had a lot of changes in Alaska over time. The next slide just shows oil production by geographic region, where our competition's coming from. It used to come from the world, you know, the Middle East, South America, Mexico even. Now it's coming from within the US, the Permian Basin in Texas, the Gulf of Mexico, Eagle Ford, which is also in Texas, Bakken, which is in North Dakota, and Niobrara, which is in Colorado. And if you look at those slides, all of them over the 10 years from 2007 to 17 have increased in production. A lot of that's fracking. You get a quicker return on your investment, et cetera, et cetera. But look at Alaska. Alaska has trended down over that same period of time. We've seen declines. Next slide. So this is U.S. oil, crude oil production from 2007 to 17 compared to Alaska's. Alaska's the flat line on the bottom. Now, flat is kind of good because it means that we have, even though we're seeing some production declines, we've flattened the decline a little bit. When you go to the next slide, what it shows is against that competition where we're trying to compete for investment dollars in Alaska, and not just globally, but with other investment opportunities in the United States. This is the production cost in other areas of the United States and in Canada. And Alaska's North Slope is the most expensive. The next slide goes back to exactly what we were talking about before. Production in Alaska has been declining since 1988. We are at a quarter of the production we had in 1988. That's important to remember. So the next slide just says the status quo is okay. We don't need a fiscal plan because oil and gas is going to save us. And the reality is we have to compete with larger, more accessible plays throughout the country and world. Our fiscal situation is a real and significant disincentive to investment in Alaska. And global oil down is now affecting oil demand, and that's in part because of the pandemic. So the next slide starts on, you know, we don't need taxes. All we need is more economic development. So the next slide begins the discussion. Is economic development alone the solution? Next slide is, next slide I put in here when I was commissioner because I actually had someone who got upset with me because they said, oh, you're saying you're not in favor of economic development. This administration isn't in favor of economic development. And I said, that's ridiculous. Of course, economic development is vital to Alaska, but all I'm trying to do with this presentation is show how our revenue structure doesn't take into account that economic development in Alaska brings with it costs to the state for regulation, for schools, for health and social services, for public safety, all kinds of things. And in order to position yourself to really take advantage of the economic opportunities in Alaska, you've got to have a foundation in order to provide for the costs that come with economic development and the population. So I devised, when I was a borough mayor, an economic development scenario, and the next slide begins that. The hypothesis is that a company proposes a major investment in Kenai Peninsula Borough. We'll call it a widget factory or whatever you want to call it. The evaluation is that it has to be economic viable for both the state and the Kenai Peninsula Borough. And the project must pay its own way, meaning it's going to cover the costs that come with economic development. So in this hypothetical, go to the next slide.
But
In the Kenai Peninsula Borough, Kenai Peninsula Borough, with a $1 billion capital investment in this new widget factory, it would create 5,000 new jobs, of which about 20% of them would be filled by local residents, 4,000 new residents, some with families, which would include 2,500 new students in the school district, that $1 billion in capital investment, and 4,000 new housing units at an average taxable value of $200,000 per home. That's the assumptions that we're making in this. Now, the next slide talks about how it impacts the Kenai Peninsula Borough. It would cost us, because of our share of education funding, $14 million a year in increased school funding, but the Kenai Borough would get $2 million a year in borough sales taxes from the increased activity in the economy, $8 million a year in borough area-wide property taxes on homes, and $10 million a year in borough area-wide property taxes on the factory investment. So the next slide shows that for the Kenai Peninsula Borough, it makes good sense. $6 million would be available in excess of the additional $14 million in cost for increased school funding. $6 million is available for other things. It's a good deal for Alaska. So the next one shows that yes, the decision for the borough tax base covers the cost of the services that result from the development. The next one begins the discussion about what about the state? How does the state pay for the costs that come along with the economic development, the state costs? So the next slide shows that within the Kenai Peninsula Borough, the new expenses would be $4 million higher for expenses for troopers, highways, courts, prison, agency operations, et cetera, et cetera. This I think does not include Medicaid. So I'll discuss that in a little bit. $22.5 million a year in increased school funding costs, a 25% gain in enrollment for the Kenai Peninsula Borough. And the way that it works in the Kenai Peninsula Borough and all of the incorporated areas is that the state pays the bulk of the education costs. In the Kenai Peninsula Borough, the Kenai Borough pays for 1/3, the state pays for 2/3. And so we go to the next slide, and what it shows is the state has $26.5 million in additional expenses as a result of $1 billion in economic development investment in Alaska and a creation of 5,000 new jobs. The state has $26.5 million in additional expenses and 0 new revenue. So for the state, this next slide, for the state, the decision should be, without any increased new revenue to support those services, the state should say, wow, this is not good for us. Now, we know economic development is good for the state, but we don't have a way currently to assess that economic activity in order to pay for the costs of servicing that economic activity and the jobs that are created and the people that move here and the kids in school, et cetera, et cetera. And this example has used the Kenai Peninsula Borough, but go to the next slide, and I assessed it over the various boroughs, larger boroughs within the state. And for every single one of them, the local impact is positive, the state impact is negative. That really is telling in terms of how the state benefits from economic activity if it's not in oil and gas. So the next slide just points out that that's a hypothetical, but diversifying Alaska's economy is not hypothetical. And now I go through the slides again. The next one just shows that decline curve that we've seen for oil and gas development. The next slide shows GDP in oil and gas. The next slide shows GDP in other sectors. And the next slide will show, again, that disconnect. We've diversified our economy, but we have not diversified our tax base or our revenue base. And so we're relying on an industry, oil and gas, that is at a quarter of the production that it was in 1988 to pay for 100% of the cost of services that go along with all of the other economic development in Alaska. So next slide is, will economic development save us? Well, the state needs to recognize, and the legislature and the public needs to recognize that the costs associated with economic development and determine how we're going to pay for them. Our economy is developing and diversifying. Our revenues are not. So the next slide just gets into the very last one. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because quite frankly, we've cut government, and I'll talk a little bit about why cutting government is not the best move at this particular time, unless you can find areas of efficiency. So cutting government will save us. The next slide, can't we just cut expenses more and find our way in? Well, the next slide shows that in FY18, unrestricted petroleum revenue was 1.8 billion, and non-petroleum unrestricted revenue from every other thing was $536 million in taxes. So the next slide just starts into, and many of you may have seen this slide. If not, in Alaska, there's really only two big categories of spending in the state. One is K through 12 education, and one is the health and social services budget, which is mostly the Medicaid portion. And so when you talk about cutting the budgets, you're talking about trying to cut education, which has broad support throughout Alaska, or cutting Medicaid. And Medicaid, we get a $1 for dollar at least. It's actually a little bit more than that, dollar for dollar investment from the federal government for the money that the state puts in. So you get a 2 for 1 bang for your buck in the economy. And the next slide looks at where the municipalities benefit from state help. It's not a big bureaucracy that the dollars are just sitting there and you can cut those. These are transfer payments to municipalities. And in FY17, the Kenai Peninsula Borough got from municipal community assistance 1.9 million, reimbursement for school bond debt 2.3 million, state assistant for retirement liability, that's the PERS, TERS, and if somebody wants to ask after the end of this, I can explain that too. Foundation formula funding for K through 12 schools, which is significant, and pupil transportation reimbursement. So 103 million in state funds came to the borough as basically transfer payments. It was invested into our local economy. So the next slide shows of that, it was about $5 billion budget, general fund budget, where the other municipalities gain funds. So this slide just shows that almost $1 billion of that $5 billion just in these 5 communities as transfer payments. So it's investment, it hires teachers, it hires troopers, it pays for the court systems, all of those things that well, it doesn't pay for the court system, that's the state budget, but this is for education, other things that the state pays to local government that keep local residents' taxes down. So the next slide just shows that will cutting government save us? Well, cuts have real impacts that have to be weighed. When cutting government means cutting services, cutting local services, or increasing local taxes to make up for that difference. So we have to recognize that cutting government will negatively impact the economy. And back to Medicaid just for a moment. When you cut Medicaid, you know, Medicaid is not, well, it gets beat up a little bit, but the reality is it goes to pay for health costs for low income and elderly people mostly. And we get a dollar for dollar investment from the state. So if you're going to cut that, let's say we want to cut that $1 million, you're taking $2 million out of the state's economy, and it affects, again, small businesses. It's going to be a firestorm when they get to that. They keep talking about it like it's a simple thing to do, but I'll just give you one little anecdotal. I was on, when Sean Parnell was governor, I was on the advisory committee for Medicaid reform. we just tried to do one thing. We were just going to say for all of the therapies, physical therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, all of the therapies that are out there, that we would do after the initial diagnosis and treatment protocol, we would then have a peer review process that would determine whether you're getting the outcomes that you wanted, whether the patient was progressing as you would expect, whether it was appropriate for that particular patient. And the therapy community just came out of the woodwork and said, government should not be between the provider and the patient. You know, you remember the old argument about government healthcare not getting between the doctor and the patient. Now it's gone to provider and the patient. And I said, as long as the state is paying for it, we need to figure out whether we can make it sustainable, because the growth in Medicaid, quite frankly, is I think not sustainable, but it needs to be managed to a solution, not cut to a solution. So the next slide just poses a question, the perfect solution. And now the next slide is the perfect solution. Yeah, there isn't one. The fact of the matter is, the next slide shows what the options are: budget cuts, taxes, or permanent fund earnings. That's really the three options that we have. All of them have negative consequences in the economy and in residents' lives. But those really are the options that are available to us. All of them have political consequences, which makes it difficult. And by the way, we're not supposed to find a solution that's going to be there for perpetuity. We need to find something that will put us on a path forward to a better economic outlook for Alaska. And then legislatures and governors are going to change that over time, fine tune those things as we move forward. So as the next slide shows, our economy is bright. We have lots of opportunities, economic opportunities in Alaska. But as the next slide points out, unless we handle the disconnect, we will continue to be a disincentive to investment in Alaska, because nobody knows who's going to pay the bills for the deficit we already have, never mind the increased costs that will come along with economic development in Alaska. And the last slide is just to show that we do have a bright future if we properly prepare for it. That's my presentation. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity. And I'm happy to answer questions or engage in some dialogue.
Carl, do you want to unmute yourself? I think Carl Schroeder raised his hand. Carl? Carl's there somewhere. Mike, I would comment, when you were calculating the costs of to the Kenai Peninsula Borough of the investment, when you were mayor at the time, what you were looking at was the LNG terminal, wasn't it? I mean, this wasn't a hypothetical exercise.
Well, actually, no, because the LNG terminal would have been oil and gas. They were talking about, in fact, they changed the structure on that to go to a PILT, a payment in lieu of taxes, instead of us being able to tax the infrastructure that's built. But in that case, the state was going to get a portion of the share of those revenues, rather than just going to local governments. In the case of a widget factory or something else that was put in place, that investment would be taxed by the local government. But let's assume it's an LLC. LLCs aren't taxed by the state. Mm-hmm. Either are professional corporations, just C corps.
Okay, thank you.
And I should point out that what's important to remember about that production curve that we see is that a lot of the new development is in the NPRA, the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska. The National Petroleum Reserve started as the Naval Reserve, Naval Petroleum Reserve. It was set up in 1918, I believe. It was not part of the revenues that would accrue to the state under the statehood compact when we became a state. So we don't get the state does not get the revenues from oil development, most of it in the NPRA. That goes to the federal government. Now, Ted Stevens in about 1986, I think, got a provision put in place that says that the 50% of those rents, royalties, and leases would come to the state, but for the exclusive use of those communities within or directly adjacent to the NPRA. And that's 6 villages on the North Slope. So that's important to keep in mind when we're replacing oil from Prudhoe Bay or Kaparak or the other fields that are on state lands with oil from NPRA. We don't get the same level of revenues.
How about Anwar, Mike?
Anwar, we don't get the same level of revenues as it would be on state land, but we do get 50% of those revenues. And the statehood called for 90%, but when it passed, it was at 50%. And I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Hey, Joe, you had a couple of people with hands raised, Ronald Inouye and then John Pugh.
Go ahead. I mean, they just have to unmute themselves. They're all allowed, everybody except is allowed to talk.
John, you can go ahead.
Okay.
And then Craig Bledsoe, I'll unmute you next.
Thanks, Mike, for your presentation. I really appreciate you doing this. The thing that I would ask, so here we got essentially growing industries. When you say diversification of the economy, you've got tourism, you've got an increase in mining, and with a lot of folks talking about mining as the future in Alaska. Having said that, how do you see that we can tap revenues from those industries? Mining, for example, for all the mining that we have in the state, I think we get $2 or $3 million of taxes into the state. It's unbelievable how little there is, despite the talk from many, many legislators about the development and all these jobs that we have, which basically means that we're all going to lose money. So that's a good example. Tourism has some of the similar kind of things because they use a lot of out-of-state employees who take their money outside the state. So how do you begin to think about how do we capture those revenues?
You know, you've raised a very good point. When I was in the legislature, we got almost nothing. We did pass compromise in about 1987. I think that we get a little bit more for mining leases and rents, but not much. And it hasn't been changed much since then. And the reason back then was that while we had some potential for large scale mines, a lot of it was placer mining or small scale operations and very remote areas, and so very expensive. And so the concern was that we would be really hurting mom and pop operations in Alaska. And of course, the mining industry was adamantly opposed to anything. You know, nobody likes taxes at all, but we have to do one of two things. For some of those mines that'll be developed in very remote areas, you know, unless we're going to assess something to pay for the cost, we want to keep those jobs in Alaska, which I think we do. But the reality is many of them will probably be 2 and 2 or week on, week off. Same thing we have on the North Slope, and we'll see some of those people leave Alaska. If we're not going to tax it, and if we're not going to tax it in order to help pay for the cost of it, so that we can pay for their kids who are in school, and so that we can pay for public safety and road maintenance and all of those types of things. If we're not going to tax it, then we actually should encourage that they bring people up and fly them into the sites and fly them back out of Alaska, because we don't have any way to pay for the services. And I don't want that, obviously. What I want is the jobs to stay in Alaska as much as possible, and also have the opportunity to tax it in some form. So either we're going to tax the resource like we do in oil and gas, or we have to have some sort of a broad-based tax in Alaska. And broad-based tax means there's really only 3 and probably only 2 that would be worth considering. The 3 are income tax, sales tax, or property taxes. And property taxes would be, I think, the least favorable, because the big part of that, which is oil and gas, is already fully consumed. And in a lot of places in rural Alaska, there's no tax base anyway, and it's very difficult to administer it. You have to do the assessments, et cetera, et cetera. I was mayor of a Kenai Peninsula borough, which has some of those same issues. So it brings you to the other 2 possibilities: income tax or sales tax. And I hear a lot of my friends say, my more conservative friends say, well, we should go with a sales tax, that way everybody pays. I said, fine, let's model it. Let's see who it hits. Because if you put a true sales tax in place and you don't have any exemptions, it'll work. But once you start getting into the exemptions, let's say we're going to exempt oil and gas because I already paid too much, in some people's opinion. I think we should tax them more, but I think that we need a comprehensive tax policy, not just a one-sided. So are you going to exempt leases? Are you going to exempt medical transactions, real estate transactions? Are you going to cap it so that, if somebody's buying a $50,000 vehicle, they're not paying it on the full $50,000? Once you start talking about capping it or putting exemptions in, you eliminate and start eroding away the value of the revenues that you generate for the state and undermine what you're trying to accomplish. Income tax, of course, I think income tax is fair and can be progressive. Nobody likes taxes. I mean, I don't like taxes. Nobody likes taxes. I just come from old school that says if you make spending decisions, you have to make corresponding revenue decisions. And in order to do that in Alaska, we can either try to tax oil more, and I don't know what's going to happen with Prop 1. I don't think, I almost think it's irrelevant, because it's not going to change whether it passes or fails. It's not going to fix Alaska's long-term foundation, economic foundation. It will be a disincentive to additional investment, but we do need to increase oil taxes. It's just that I don't think you can get to a fair share until some of the other industries or individuals who are benefiting from programs in Alaska and public services are paying part of the cost. I'll tell one more little anecdotal story. I have 10 brothers and sisters. All of them are shareholders in our family company. We have Arby's Roast Beef in Alaska. We're set up as a sub-S corporation, so we don't pay corporate taxes in Alaska. There are no income taxes in Alaska. But guess what? There are income taxes in California and Idaho. And I have a sister who lives in Idaho and a brother who lives in California. They pay taxes on the money that our company earns 100% in Alaska in their states. And there's this thing that you can't have double jeopardy, so to speak, in taxes, so that if we had a tax program in Alaska, they would pay taxes in Alaska on the income that they earn in Alaska. Instead, they're paying taxes in their home state on income that they earn in Alaska. That's ludicrous, in my opinion.
Craig, I think you are up next.
Thank you. Yeah, a great presentation, Mike. And I'm going to go on a related direction, and that is, so you are in charge of marketing for the borough of and cities in the Kenai. So what would you focus, or what types of people would you like to have move to the state who would deliver the maximum benefit and consume the minimum amount of resources? And the reason I ask that is that some of these seem pretty obvious to me. As I pointed out last week, my daughter, who works for Amazon, fled the riot zones in Seattle and has bought a home here in the Anchorage municipality. She has been told that she can work from home for the rest of her career. So she is one of many people in similar situations who are coming to Alaska because of the environment and so on. So she is bringing herself and her assets to Alaska and not consuming a whole lot. Even beyond that, you have retirees. You have a beautiful environment that you can market to retirees. And as we know from the baby boom, they're increasing in their numbers. What do you think about that direction? What sort of people do you want to have come that are going to benefit our infrastructure and not consume much?
Well, obviously that would be probably seniors and either single people or people with no kids, because education costs a lot, and so does healthcare for kids. Of course, you know, the senior population and I have to join Medicare next year. I'll be 65. So they have you know, government funded healthcare for the most part. It doesn't cover everything. Obviously, there's a lot more that goes with it. You know, I think we need to honor and recognize the economic value of our seniors. But in the Kenai Peninsula Borough, when I was mayor and I left that job in 2017, I was termed out. When I left that job, the Kenai Peninsula was the senior population was the fastest growing population demographically in the state, was moving to the Kenai. And part of the reason for that is that we exempt them from taxes. We have the state exemption for seniors is $150,000. The Kenai Peninsula Borough has another $150,000. On top of that, we have a $50,000 residential exemption that goes to everybody, including seniors. So we're up to $350,000. And then if your house is still valued at more than that, it is capped under the borough code at no more than 2% of your annual income. So, and the thing is, we exempt them from hospital service areas. We exempt them from fire and emergency services. And that doesn't make any sense to me. I get it from general government because their kids aren't in school, et cetera. But seniors disproportionately use emergency services more. Just it's a fact. And for fire services, you know, it's non-discriminatory. It just happens where it happens. So I think what we need to do is build an economy that recognizes that if we're going to, or build an Alaska so that we have economic opportunity that's going to create jobs, and the people who take those jobs, if we can get them to live, work of course, but live in Alaska, bring their families to Alaska, all of that's good. And I don't think you should try to target only those who are non-consumers. I mean, parents without kids and things like that. I think that just wouldn't look right to me, I guess. So I think what you need to do is build the foundation, and then depending on the types of individuals that you see and how you want to benefit them. If you want senior benefits, fine. Who's going to pay? How do we pay for those senior benefits? You know, and educational costs and health social services are the biggest costs that the state has. How are we going to pay for that on an ongoing basis? And so I think you need to build the economic foundation in Alaska that says we're going to make sure that we can pay at the minimal level at least the cost of the services that we expect to see in Alaska, and then over time fine tune it. You know, we're not going to get to a plan that's going to be there forever. It's going to be subject to changes, the whims of the voters, the demands of the public, things like that. So you have to fine tune it. And that also means fine tuning taxes, because when you put something in place, it's not going to be perfect. It should be amended and changed. You know, you hear the rhetoric now. I'm a recovering politician. I'll put that caveat out there.
Mike, and I would point out, not only you're a recovering politician, but you're a Democrat who talks about we can't have services without being able to pay for them.
Well, no longer a Democrat. I changed my party affiliation to nonpartisan recently for a variety of reasons, but mostly so I could.
I'm just teasing you, Mike.
No, and so I think what we need to do is make sure we have a foundation in place, and then we can shift that tax and the burden when we think it makes sense. But right now, what we have is this, not only is a disconnect there for the other areas of the economy that we've seen growth over the last 20 years, but we have a disconnect now because of the permanent fund dividend and the fact that, the statutory formula and the percent of market value that we're now seeing some revenues go to be able to use for state government, it's not enough. We've been hammered in terms of our oil and gas revenue. We've been hammered in terms of our tourism revenue. And so it simply is not viable or feasible to pay a statutory dividend of $3,000 and you don't have enough money. You have to overdraw the permanent fund, and once you start doing that, you're on a path where you're eating your seed corn or selling your assets to support your lifestyle, and that's a bad economic plan. I think you make spending decisions, you make revenue decisions on an annual basis.
Let's see, Rosie. Carl, are you still there? You had your hand up, I think.
Okay, it looks like Ron's got his hand up, and Catherine and David.
Sorry, Ron. Yeah, Rosie did mention that.
Oh, thanks for that very, very interesting presentation. I keep valuing the fact that there are people like you who have been through the mill, who have had the actual practical experience. My question is the legislature the appropriate vehicle to try to narrow and get any solution? Because they are there for set periods of time. They're there to be reelected. And I don't know if they would even admit that this is an issue that has to be dealt with. How do you reach beyond them to the public?
You have raised an incredibly valid point, and here's how I answer that. I agree with you. I mean, I was in the legislature for 12 years. I tried to act responsibly. I think most legislators still try to act responsibly. They get caught up in this system where they think, and when I went down there as commissioner after having left there and come back and been in business and local government, I guess I recognize that people there think that the public is paying attention and hanging on every single thing they do, and they're not. We elect people, hopefully, to responsibly administer to government the way we would do it if we were there. And so I don't think that's happening. I mean, it used to be elections were over, everybody would get together and compromise and figure out what the best thing is for public policy and move forward. That's my recollection of how it used to be. And it's changed to where now, once election is over, you start on the next election. And instead of giving somebody credit for something that may be a good idea, you want to undermine it so that with talking points and social media, et cetera, it really is harming our ability to govern. And I think what needs to happen, and what I am sort of working on, is I think we need to build a broader coalition. The oil and gas industry always opposes oil and gas taxes, no question. Not only that, they won't weigh in on other tax policy in Alaska because they don't want to be the ones saying, don't tax us, put an income tax in place or a state sales tax in place or something else. And so we end up with these back and forth debates where we, in 2014, we saw an election to repeal Senate Bill 21, it failed. Ever since then, we've not been able to get much of anything in terms of changes to the oil and gas tax code, even though there needs to be some changes. And I could tell you about some other ones that I learned about when I was commissioner, but it was we need to broaden the coalition. It shouldn't be left up to the people in Juneau. The people in Juneau, there's some very good people there, but it was interesting for me because I first ran when I was 27. When I took office, I was 28. I thought I was going down there with real legislators. And I thought, man, they're going to see through me right off the bat. And what I found out when I got down there is, the legislature doesn't belong on a pedestal. They're just people. There's some really smart, some not so smart. some who work hard, some who are lazy. It's a cross section of people in our community. They're not the best and brightest. They're just the people who got elected, and not everybody runs. And so what we need to do is help them, because you're right, they're held hostage a little bit to elections. They know they have to do certain things, and there's, the lobbying that takes place is phenomenal. There's a lot of influence that gets brought on people in order to affect their decisions or influence their decisions going forward. And so I think we need to broaden the coalition of businesses and individuals, the banking community, the oil and gas industry, the general business community, individuals, nonprofits. Everybody has to get on the same page and be willing to say, look, we need a plan. And people need to be willing to go out on a limb, including the oil and gas industry, to say we shouldn't be the only ones taxed. You don't hear them saying that. What you hear them saying is, don't tax us. It will affect investment in Alaska, and it'll hurt jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you need to build a broader coalition of including local governments, including rotaries and chambers and things like that. That's going to carry the message that says we don't have to agree on a perfect plan. We just have to agree on a plan, put it in place, and then change it over time, fine tune it, not repeal and replace, which is the more recent talking points about legislation. That doesn't actually happen. It's just political talking points. What happens is you amend the statutes and you change some things and you keep other things, but repeal and replace is much easier to explain or say. Sorry, that was kind of a long answer to your question, but I think we just need to broaden the support and understanding, educate. And that's part of why I tried to put a presentation together that showed, in the hypothetical that I used, that showed the impacts and how we pay for it locally. We pay for our services locally through taxes. We get a bunch of money from the state. How do we pay for that? We don't. Well, we do, but I guess indirectly because of oil on state land.
Catherine?
Thank you very much. I'm fascinated, first of all, and thank you for your beautiful description of democracy as far as your legislature is concerned. I like that, just regular people. So here's the problem. I live in Canada. I live in Toronto, and I really am gobsmacked by your explanation about how should I put this? It's really expensive to live in the north. And in our north, our government helps with transfer payments to the various territorial governments. So I wonder, first of all, if that's the case in Alaska. And secondly, I'm now understanding that you don't charge income taxes as a way of offsetting the costs of living in the north. Like, I'm very confused.
Yeah, at the state level, we don't have any state taxes on individuals. We pay a tax on our vehicles for every other year, registration fee on that. Part of that goes to local government. Education is mostly paid for at the state level. Alaska is different than Canada, obviously, but then a lot of the states in the US also, because we have borough governments, which are like counties, but where they have a county sheriff and a county courthouse, et cetera. The state has all of the responsibility for the court system in Alaska. It's a centralized system, and the state is responsible, pays all the costs associated with it. Health and social services, most of that is federal and state money. So for the services we get in Alaska, it's been fueled for a long time. It used to be back pre-1980, where we had an income tax in Alaska. We had a very small $10 a year, I think, school tax. I'm old enough to have paid taxes on income in Alaska, but we repealed that because we had excess oil and gas revenues and so we didn't need to tax our citizens. We had more money than we could spend, really, and fortunately we did save some of it in a permanent fund for when it became a rainy day. The legislature back then recognized, and the reason we set up the permanent fund, you recognized that oil and gas is a non-renewable resource. And so it was a grand experiment to try to take a non-renewable resource and turn it into a renewable resource, which is investment in equities and other things. It worked. It worked. We've saved $60+ billion. We've seen a decline in oil and gas. We now passed legislation that allows some of it to be used for state services, et cetera. But we've run into a conflict with citizens who are demanding a payment that is more than really the state can afford, given our financial circumstances now. So we don't pay a lot for services, and we actually get a cash payment from the state on an annual basis. Not only do we get a cash payment, we have a hold harmless program, because if, the bigger that dividend gets, the more we're hit with a hold harmless. And what we do with a hold harmless is we say that because that payment in a 1 month period, let's say it's $1,000 or $2,000, let's say it's $2,000 in a 1 month period, it affects people who are on welfare and are on Medicaid. They get, under the federal laws, they get not kicked off, but ineligible for a period of time for those services. And so we pay for those services out of an assessment against the all the permanent fund dividends that are paid out. And I don't know if you've seen that when you get your check or checked into it, but that is in fact one of the provisions of the permanent fund dividend.
Dave?
Yes, Mike, were you in the freshman class with Roger Jenkins in the legislature?
I believe I was, yes.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was his aide.
Oh, okay. Yep.
I also came to Alaska to build a pipeline, and so I got to pay those income tax. And I know that a lot of people then also paid Alaska state income tax, and they went back to Illinois and some of the other states, and they did have to pay their state income tax also on the same money.
Yep.
I was always thought, and this would affect me because I don't live in Alaska long enough a year, even though I classified it as my residency. I move so much around, travel, that I think an income tax on people would be a good idea, especially if we exempt so much for people who get paid permanent fund dividends. And what I'm saying is that way, the people from out of state who just use our services and take our money and leave the state, they would pay an income tax for doing that, for just coming here and working the summer and grabbing all the money they can and leaving, or the guys that work a week on, week off on the slope and things. I'd like you to speak on that.
Well, I in 1991, 92, I chaired the House Finance Committee. I was co-chair with Eileen McLean. And I was talking about a long-range fiscal plan there. And, interestingly enough, I went to Fairbanks to talk to the Alaska Municipal League. And what I talked about was the need for a long-range fiscal plan and what options we had available to us. And I said, we really only have a couple options. We can cut government, we can increase taxes, or we can use earnings of the permanent fund, or some combination of those three. Here we are, what, 30 years later? We're in the same situation. Back then it might have been, who knows, maybe it would have been a bad idea, but the fact is that we are in a a time in our history where we're undermining the very institutions that make our country and our states great. And that is our government institutions. It didn't used to be a bad thing to be a public employee, but we end up attacking public employees because they're an easy target, and it's you know, and we attack with negative campaigning and things like that. We attack people who are running for the legislature, and we assail people's reputations, and we accuse them of all kinds of things. So, and then we also have, you know, we have this phenomena, I guess I'll call it, where people are asking to sign pledges. Pledge you're not going to raise any taxes. Pledge you're going to do a full statutory dividend. Pledge these types of things during a campaign. And what it does, it makes it that much more difficult for whoever happens to get elected and becomes part of those institutions to actually govern. And then it becomes even more difficult because the focus is not on public policy and working together to find compromises. The focus is on the next election. We need to get past that and recognize somehow that we need to work together, or we're gonna collapse together, not just in the state, but in the country.
Yeah, John, you had your hand up again, and then I think we have a question from Willis Kirkpatrick. Commissioner, would you, after John, but would you speak to what you think are pros and cons of a state income tax? Although I think you may have already addressed that.
You know, I'll start with the cons. Of course, the cons are it has an impact on people's incomes, because you're paying a portion of your hard-earned income to help the state pay for services. And it has a negative impact on the economy. But it is progressive, meaning if you structure it properly, you know, the more you earn, the more you pay, basically. And you exempt the lower levels so that people can pay for the basic needs and services that they have as individuals and as families. So that's really the biggest negatives. The positives is that it's a tool in your fiscal policy package that you can increase or decrease or change in order to pay for the costs of the services that are demanded and needed throughout Alaska, in communities and in places in rural Alaska, you know, including our university. My God, our university system is being so beaten down that, in my opinion, that we're going to struggle for a few years with we're going to start seeing, I think, kids leaving Alaska more and more. And so it becomes this spiral downward that is tough to get out of, all because we have, over the last 25 years, been indoctrinated into the idea that taxes are bad. All taxes are bad. The fact of the matter is we need an education. We need to educate the public on why we have taxes in the first place, and why there are governments which are set up and originally set up to provide for the things in common that would be cost prohibitive individually. If you live at the end of a 10-mile road and you're the only one who has a grader, you plow that road. Or do you buy a grader so you can plow that road? Or let's say you live at mile 5. What about someone who lives 5 miles down? Instead of putting the burden on 1 or 2 of the people who live there, you tax everybody in that area in order to pay for a common service. You know, I think we need to get back to recognizing that there is value in government as long as it is responsibly administered.
You know, Mike,
I don't think there's a big downside to income tax.
I was going to make one comment, which is that that from the stuff I've seen, and Professor Albrecht might be able to comment about that a bit more. Strong universities, strong research universities are one of the major economic drivers in the 21st century economy. And if you look at any place that's really thriving economically, you'll usually find them centered around that. You know, the Boston area with MIT and Harvard, you know, the San Francisco Bay Area with Berkeley and Stanford, that kind of thing. Seattle with University of Washington.
Well, I don't know if Professor Albrecht wants to weigh in on that, but
Well, I could weigh in a second. First of all, Mike, great job. I really enjoyed what you had to say, but I think, like Joe says, there's no question that you're seeing major development around universities, the brains and the smart people there. Plus, it is critical that we educate our young people. You know, in increasingly the importance of having an advanced education is growing. The gap is getting larger between those with a degree and those aren't. So I think it's absolutely, like you said, absolutely vital to strengthen our universities.
Yeah.
In
John,
this modern world.
So what I want to get back to was on the income tax, because Mike, there's an issue to me that's really big and has been ever since you were in the legislature. The Labor Department has almost annually put out how much of the wages in Alaska go out of the state. And it's well over $1 billion. I think it may be up now to $2 billion of wages that go outside the state that we get nothing. Basically, people are working in Alaska and that don't have to pay 1 cent to work in Alaska, take their wages to a cheaper place to live and live like kings outside, whether it's the mining industry, the oil industry. And it seems like that issue never gets a real good public deal, because the oil companies and the mining companies hate it because half of their people are living outside and they don't want that issue brought to the fore. How can we get that issue on the table, get Alaskans to really understand that this is really important? And also you could put in some things in there where you could discount certain things. For example, I remember Steve McAlpine, as lieutenant governor, was talking about this and said, hey, put in property taxes as a discount against that, you know, because they're not paying property taxes in Alaska. So anyway, I just don't understand why legislators and others and leaders can't get on top of that, because it makes so much sense.
well, part of the reason, and something that has frustrated me when I was in the legislature, was that, you know, there is a lot of focus on getting reelected, and taxes are never going to be popular. But you know, our reality is coming straight at us, because we don't have enough revenues, not only this year, but in future years, for what is being demanded, at least seems like it's being demanded now from the public. You know, in the recent elections, a lot of people who lost their elections over the dividend, or for joining a coalition. You know, the reality is in Alaska is that most people are not affiliated with either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. They're registered something else, mostly nonpartisan or some other party. But the polarization that we see in primaries kind of push people, in my opinion, to the far right in the Republican Party and the far left in the Democratic Party. And we have, that's why I'm supporting Prop 2, by the way. I know I'm probably not supposed to say political things on here. You can find me, Joe.
How am I going to collect? You're not a Rotary member, Mike. Speaking of which.
Well, so we have to, that's why we need a broader coalition. One of the things that allows things to be obfuscated is we don't always talk off the same set of information. Everybody generates their own information. You'll see most of mine is sourced, federal sources, state sources, because we have to speak from the same information. If everybody can throw their own information out there and use it in order to really confuse the public. And remember, we live in a republic. where we elect people who are supposed to make those decisions on our behalf, and they should know more than we do. People who are in elected office, if they don't know more than the general public, they're not doing their job. And so I think we need to rebuild trust in the legislature. And in order to do that, you have to build a broader coalition of people from all aspects of our society, and start educating and continuing to reinforce that education with people from outside the legislature, because too often people in the legislature are given credibility for what they know, when in fact their information doesn't go very deep. And so we need to get people on the same wavelength, so to speak, in terms of the information that's being generated and discussed, so that if I'm talking to somebody, when I give the same presentation, whether I'm talking to Rotary, or whether I'm talking to the Kenai Peninsula Borough Assembly, or whether I'm speaking to the Municipal League, or whether I'm speaking to a chamber meeting, it's got to be the same information. It's got to be credible, and you have to have people calling out, responsible people calling out the legislators who are confusing the issue and using bad information. We have to get back to where we can elect a legislature that we're going to trust, but we have to hold them accountable. And right now, the public is easily confused because there is so much information that gets bombarded them with that they don't understand. I'll give you one example in Alaska where they talk about, and I've heard it said over and over and over again, including in the last gubernatorial election, that we don't need taxes. We just need more oil development. We need more oil in the pipeline. Well, and I pointed out that there's a difference between oil on state land and oil on federal lands, or oil on native lands, because the state doesn't get those revenues. So while we would see economic activity and jobs created, both directly for those oil companies, indirectly for the service companies, et cetera, and then even more indirectly in an economy, you see the multiplier effect where you see retail jobs and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you see a growth in the economy, but the state would not see the same level of revenues for that new oil development that we'd see if it was on state land. So, and the public, the general public does not know that. Nobody's saying it enough to them that, look, there's differences, there's nuances. And instead, we look for the talking points, or the sound bites and things like that, which aren't educating. They're really just confusing a public that has, quite frankly, the capacity to understand, but they also have a very, very short attention span.
Okay, I think Mike, we're going to be running kind of late in a bit, so would you take one last question?
Sure.
Okay, let's see, who has, Catherine, I think you have your hand up.
I did have my hand up, and thank you again for a fascinating insight into a very difficult situation in your state. But what I'm curious about, and I really wonder, the whole issue of oil and gas development. I mean, the question of climate change surely must be playing in Alaska as well. Our own province of Alberta has gone over to the other side and is now looking at plastic recycling as its primary industry. So there are clearly issues about oil and gas development that need to be addressed.
You are absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And we'll see that. I mean, we'll see the transition take place, whether it's carbon taxes or, I guess I'm still, as cynical as I've become at times, I'm still cautiously optimistic that we'll get it figured out and we'll make the responsible decisions, in part because we're going to get forced into it. But I guess when I talk about oil and gas development in Alaska, we've heard a lot about diversifying Alaska's economy. We have diversified Alaska's economy. If we're going to and we're going to see oil and gas development for a long period of time in Alaska because the infrastructure is already in place. The investment's already been made in many of them. So, and I think it makes good sense unless we're going to stop all oil and gas use, which we're not, then it's going to be done somewhere. We should get a benefit of part of that economy. At the same time, we have to recognize that we have to evolve because, just speaking of oil and gas, if we start seeing carbon taxes and things like that, we may see additional expenses that come to the oil and gas industry to where they won't be able to support as much in Alaska as they have in the past. And so I think what we have to recognize is that things are going to change and we better evolve with them. Right now, all our eggs are in one basket, and it is a basket with some significant flaws in it.
Mike, Joe, one thing I did see that may be pertinent to Catherine's question, there are some calculations, Lily, that suggest that because Alaska oil and gas tends to tap into very large pools and then go primarily by pipeline and tanker, that it actually is more lower carbon footprint than a lot of other energy developments just because of the nature of the oil and gas deposits up here. In other words, it's a lower net carbon by a fair bit than we might see if the same energy were produced elsewhere. So that's been considered as being potentially economically as well as environmentally advantageous for Alaska. And in fact, it suggests if there's a carbon tax, Alaska might in fact benefit from the imposition of a carbon tax, believe it or not.
Yeah, and Catherine, one of the things that we've seen in Alaska is a reduction in actually coal development. It's actually, we've seen it worldwide, both coal production and coal usage, because natural gas or even oil is better in terms of the impact of the environment. But the environmental issues are going to push us to make changes. And in Alaska, what we're seeing with climate change and global warming is in some areas of rural Alaska, villages are, I think there's either 32 or 38 villages that have been identified as being threatened as we see climate change progress with having to be relocated. Now, we are in the process of relocating Kivalina, and that's a separate issue because it was really on a barrier island, and it needed to be needs to be relocated. We just the story some of you who live in Alaska may have heard about the village that didn't get their ballots because they didn't know anybody was there. That's Newtok, which is in southwestern Alaska. Was recently, it's in the process of being relocated to Murtarvik, which is 8 miles up the river. It's on a different bend of the river. The river was eroding the community. It already washed out the dock. It was threatening the school. It's threatening the community. So they're moving 8 miles away. Relocating that village, relocating any village is very, very expensive. And we, that my estimate, because the report came out when I was commissioner, I didn't really get to participate in crafting it, but the report came out when I was commissioner. I had to go give it to the legislature to relocate that village, Newtok to Murtarvik, is expected to cost at the end of the relocation perhaps as much as $500,000 per resident. Per resident.
Wow.
When you build them a new school, when you build them a new airport, and there are no it's a subsistence economy in that village, and so the cost may be less than that. They're trying to find different ways, but it is very, very, very significant in terms of the cost of relocating. And currently, I don't know how we're going to possibly pay for if we end up as a progression that type of cost over and over again.
We have one question from Sarah here. Does the state get tax money from a mine on private native corporation property if it's not in a borough or otherwise?
Does the state get,
Does
if
the
it's on
state
native
get
lands?
tax money from a mine on private native corporation land? And then the second question, how about if it's not in a borough?
If it's not in a borough, it would go to the state. If there was taxes on it, there would be corporate income taxes, but if it's on native lands or private lands, they go to the landowner, not to the state.
Okay, so basically there's no tax on land in on a mine, let's say in a private native land?
No, and that's a example I'll use is the Red Dog Mine. The Red Dog Mine started out, a good deal of it was on state lands. The expansion, a lot of the expansion is either taking place or has to take place or is going to be on native lands, not state lands. So that will also impact state revenues. I don't know to what extent, but I know that it will. So yeah, and if it's not in a borough, and you raise a good point. In a lot of places in Alaska, we're unincorporated, and if it's unincorporated, like where the oil and gas pipeline goes through communities that are unincorporated, the state gets the 20 mils tax on that. If it's incorporated, the incorporated community does. Fairbanks, I don't know if anybody's on from Fairbanks. I think Fairbanks gets maybe $17 million a year because of the value of the Trans-Alaska pipeline that runs through the Fairbanks North Star Borough. But there's little or very little impact from that to the borough. Does that make sense? Because most of it's buried. They do have impact from oil and gas industry because they have service companies, they have people who live there, who work on the North Slope, et cetera, but they tax those already, so.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Well, I'll take one more look here. Mike, thank you so much. On behalf of Rotary District 5010, we very much appreciate you providing us with this opportunity. This will be recorded. Well, it's been recorded. It will be made into an MP4 and put onto the borough's YouTube site, and we'll be posting links elsewhere as well. We'll be sending links around to the individual Rotarians so they have the opportunity to get back and take a look at it at a later time should they so desire. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. So what you're saying is anything I've said can and will be used against me?
What I'm saying is,
Just kidding.
what I'm saying, Mike, is just like when I take a witness statement, now you agree that this is to be recorded, we can share this witness statement, right?
Yeah.
Now, thanks very much. I mean, you've had a long and exemplary 36-year career in public service intermixed with private business, which, and I will say, I've never heard anybody say anything bad about you in all that time, and I've lived through the whole time. And
I have.
And yeah, oh yeah, right. And you've always just had a reputation for absolute integrity. So thank you for your, straight from the hip, facing reality discussion today.
Okay, and Joe, you have my email address and my phone number. Feel free to share it. I'm happy to take phone calls or follow-up conversations if people want to have. It's something that's a passion of mine and has been for a long time. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Rosie.
So long, everybody.
Mike.
Thank you all.
Rose, you can turn off the recording, I think. Thank you, Sarah.
All right. Thank you all.